Ever feel like you're lost in wine lingo when someone asks what kind of wine you like? Well, today I'm sharing the 5 sensory characteristics will change how you experience and talk about wine forever. Once you know these, you'll be able to walk into any wine shop or restaurant and confidently say, "This is what I'm looking for." We're talking about sweetness, acidity, tannins, alcohol, and body. And that will revolutionize how you taste and select wine. By the end of this video, you'll not only be able to describe what's in your glass, but also exactly what to ask for the next time you're shopping or dining out. All right, sensory characteristic number 1, sweetness. Now, before you recoil and say, "I don't like sweet wine," because trust me, I hear that all the time. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about your grandmother's sweet wine or dandelion from the back 40. I'm talking about the scale of dry to sweeter wines. And I'm also talking about the sensation of sweetness, which comes from a fruitiness in the wine. Wines that, by the way, have been fermented completely dry. So, buckle up with an open mind and let's discuss the characteristic of sweetness. All right, so even the Germans have a scale, 7 levels of dry to sweet. So not all sweet wines are the same, and not all sweetness comes from sugary wines. Even dry wines, like I mentioned, can have a hint of fruit that gives a perception of sweetness. So don't worry, this section is not all about dessert wines. So how do we taste for sweetness? One of the things you can do that works for a lot of people is to focus on the tip of your tongue when you taste your wine, because that's where sweetness is most easily detected. So next time you take a sip, pay attention to the tip of your tongue. That's where you'll first feel the sweetness or lack. Whether you like a dry wine or something a little more plush, this is your first key to unlocking your wine preference. Sensory characteristic number 2, acidity. So what is acidity in wine? Acidity in wine a lot of times can be taken in as being zesty or maybe even a little bit refreshing in quality. Acidity gives structure and balance, especially in white wines. So acidity is that bright, crisp feeling that makes your mouth water and gives wine its refreshing character. It's what keeps a wine lively and makes it pair beautifully with food. So I did mention white wine as an example of knowing, being familiar with a zesty or refreshing type of wine. But does that mean that red wines are not acidic? Absolutely, it does not mean that. Red wines can actually be acidic on their own as well. So let me share a tip with you. If you take your wine and you swish it around in your mouth, all right, so you swallow it. Now pay attention immediately. Does it seem like there's water almost like just pouring down your cheeks? Is your tongue kind of watering a little bit? Both of those things indicates a higher acidity in the wine. In fact, acidity is like that little kick that wakes up your palate. So if your mouth's watering after you take a sip, that is a clear sign of good acidity, and it's a great way to find wines that are going to pair well with your food. Acidic wines will always pair well with food because foods need a little pickup. So just like you hear on cooking shows all the time, you should have added a little bit more acid to this. You could have used a little sprinkle of lemon, or could have used a little bit of vinegar, something like that. What they're talking about is bringing a little bit of freshness to the dish. Note, you can actually skip the lemon, pair it with a white or acidic wine, and now you've just taken care of balancing your dish. And this is what I tell people all the time. Wine was never intended to be a standalone, drink-alone beverage. It was intended to be an element or an ingredient of your meal. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be this huge meal. Could be, as it was in the original days, a piece of bread. Could mean it's a wedge of cheese. But wine is meant to pair with things, which is why it's by far the best beverage to pair with food. Now, granted, those of you who are probably sitting looking at your computer or your phone and arguing with me in your head because, well, beer is the best thing to go with spicy food. Well, sure, that absolutely happens. And there are some difficult dishes like a hot bowl of chili, spicy bowl of chili. That is very difficult to pair with wine. And sometimes there are beverages that absolutely, I will give you, go better with beer or other beverages. But by and large, statistically, when you're looking at any given meal, it will always be elevated more by pairing it with wine than any other beverage. Okay, so off my soapbox for a second. Let's go to sensory characteristic number 3, tannins. So this is one of the most common questions I get in my classes as well. So you'll notice I'm holding up a red glass of wine because very rarely do you get tannins in white. It's possible, but it's not very common. You're going to get the majority of your tannin sensation from red wines. Tannins are the drying, almost astringent feeling that are found in red wines. Tannins come from grape seeds, skins, and sometimes from the oak, in other words, the barrels where they age. So when you make white wine, basically what they do is they take the grapes, they remove the skins, and then they crush what's left and get the grape juice. The way that red wine is made is they take the grapes, crush them while they still have their skins on, and then leave the grape skins and pips, the seeds, in the juice or the grape must so that it can impart as much flavor for as long as the winemaker determines. Sometimes that's a few hours, as in like a rosé. Sometimes it can be days or weeks, as in a much more structured, tannic red wine. So how do you know if you're tasting tannins? Well, when you take a sip of wine and so a lot of times I will feel it like all the way down my cheek in kind of this diagonal direction. And then on the inside of my mouth, that's on the inside of my mouth also, but then on the center of my mouth, I feel it along my gums. So I'll feel it along my cheek, the inside of my cheek, and I'll feel it really up in my gums. It's kind of that sensation where you want to like maybe go brush your teeth because you just feel like your teeth are almost fuzzy. That is tannins. It's a drying sensation. It's the same thing that you can get from black coffee or even black tea. A lot of people will talk about it as a wine's grip because, again, it has a lot of structure, and tannins are what is required to get long, beautifully aged red wines. So tannins are a great thing, but that was the whole reason why oak barrels and aging and all of those things were experimented with and implemented in winemaking, was to get the tannins to soften and to make it much more drinkable. So it's really about balance. It's like, how much tannins do you prefer in your wine? And this is a great thing to understand when you go to a restaurant or a wine shop. Do you prefer a Pinot Noir that has very few tannins? Or do you want a big, bold cab because you know that you're going to order a steak and you want a big old piece of protein that can stand up to a tannic wine? See what I mean? So notice the drying sensation on your gums and cheeks when you're sipping a red wine. If you feel that your mouth is drying out, like I mentioned on the insides of your cheeks and on the gum line and maybe kind of in your teeth, it's the same thing as if you've had a strong cup of tea. That is the tannins at work. This is a key characteristic for people who love bold reds. It's what makes the red wine feel powerful and structured. All right, sensory characteristic number 4, alcohol. What does alcohol do in wine? Okay, snicker, snicker, I gotcha. But alcohol is the element that adds warmth and body to a wine. Sometimes I will see people who taste wine who just throw it to the back of their throat like they're doing a tequila shot. The only sensation that taster will get is the warmth and the heat in the back of their throat because they have just now tossed the wine over all of the flavor receptors in their mouth. So that is an example of how you get the warmth. If a wine is a high alcohol level, say over 13.5%, so like 13.5, 14.5% and up, a lot of you may feel a warmth in your chest. I, for one, am very sensitive to what I call hot wines. So, for example, I can tell almost always very precisely what the alcohol composition of a wine is. Once in a while, I'll be like 0.5% off, but generally I can tell exactly what the alcohol content of a wine is just by the sensation of how much heat I detect in my chest when I drink the wine. Another thing about alcohol, though, is that the richer, more full-bodied wines come from those wines with more alcohol. So if you want to keep things a little bit lighter, go with a lower alcohol wine, maybe even of the same grape, So for example, Cabernets, if you go to California and you got those grapes that are over ripening because you got that beautiful sun, but you got the cool air coming off the ocean that allows the grapes to stay on the vines longer and ripen a lot more than most other wine regions. Because those grapes ripen more, they've got more sugar in them. When you go to ferment, you take yeast to the sugar, and the yeast continues to eat the sugar, fermenting, creating alcohol until the wine is dry, meaning that there's no sugar left and all of the sugars have been converted to alcohol. Hence, that's a dry wine. And now you've got higher alcohol wine because you started with more sugar. So if you want a high alcohol cab, you want to go to a warmer climate, say like California. If you prefer your cab to be a little bit lower in alcohol, this particular example is going to give you a less fruity cab. It's going to give you more of a earthy, complex cab. But I would suggest that you maybe try a French Cabernet. Those are going to be much lower in alcohol volume because they're in a cooler climate. The grapes don't develop nearly as many sugars, and so therefore lower sugar means lower alcohol. And that also, the lower sugar, lower alcohol also continues through to if you like sweet wine, you're generally going to have a lower alcohol level. So what I do find is that people that like a little bit of sweet to their wine, sometimes it's not actually the sweet that they like. Sometimes it's the fact that the wine does not contain as much alcohol, and that makes it more enjoyable for them to drink. So just kind of giving you the science behind that so you understand those dynamics as well. So as I said, alcohol is what gives wine that little warmth or that slight burn, and it can also change how a wine feels on your palate. So think of it like the difference between a cozy sweater and a light summer dress. How to detect alcohol. So notice if you feel some warmth either in the back of your throat or maybe in your chest after swallowing. After you sip, you feel a little warmth lingering. That is the alcohol making its presence known. It's wine's little secret ingredient, and it's what gives wine its richness and its weight. Sensory characteristic number 5. What is body in wine? So let's define body as the weight or thickness of the wine in the mouth. I know that sounds weird, but if we take it and we compare the body of wine to, say, the body in milk, it'll make sense. So if we look at skim milk, how that feels in the mouth versus 2% milk versus whole milk, it's a very different experience. That is the same concept as body in wine. So body is all about how full the wine feels in your mouth. So again, it's like comparing different types of milk, light versus crisp, rich versus creamy. And as we mentioned before, body is tied to alcohol. It's also tied to sweetness and tannins. So the more alcohol you have, the more body. The more sweetness in a wine, the more body. And that makes sense, right? The viscosity, if it's a sweeter wine, it's going to be a little bit thicker, a little bit richer. And tannins. Tannins also give the wine more body. It's got more texture. Think of it that way. So if there's no tannins, it's almost like a watery texture, but once you get the drying and all of that almost chewiness, it does give the wine a fuller body and a texture. So think of it in terms of how heavy or how light does the wine feel when you take a sip. Is the wine light and airy? Is it rich and velvety? This is where you decide if you like a wine that's more refreshing or something that feels luxurious on your palate. So let's bring it all together. This is all about understanding your preferences. So we're going to combine the 5 characteristics and work together to figure out the profiles of the wines that you like. Each of these characteristics plays a role in how you experience wine. When you start recognizing sweetness, acidity, tannins, alcohol, and body, you're going to begin to piece together what you love in a wine, and you'll never feel like you're guessing again. So what you'll want to do is once you determine whether you like a light, refreshing white, or maybe you like a full-bodied but luxurious, silky red wine, you'll want to use those kinds of terms the next time you go into a wine shop or you're talking to a server or even hopefully a sommelier at your favorite restaurant. This will help you to confidently ask for the wines that match your preferences. So next time someone asks you what kind of wine you like, you'll know exactly what to say. Now, hopefully, there's more than one answer because there's a whole lot of wines out there. So there's not just one magic answer. And also, you'll find that you may like different things in different wines. So, for example, I know when I first started my wine journey, I liked very crisp, fresh, but almost watery white wine. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I liked really bold, in your face, tannic reds. Now, to give you some insight, I lived in Dallas, Texas for over 25 years. And so a lot of the business dinners and things that I was enjoying at that time were in steakhouses. So one, you had a lot of machismo of everybody else at the table, because I was usually one of the only women. A lot of people that really wanted to have the biggest, baddest, reddest, most blah, 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 blah reds. But also the foods that we were eating were rich meats, grilled meats, things like that. Those exact types of foods that pair most beautifully with a big, full red wine. So, like in my case, if you're going out ordering a Dover Sole and everybody at your table is ordering a big tannic red, that will absolutely destroy your meal. So the next time someone asks you what kind of wine you like, you'll know exactly what to say. Whether you want something light and crisp with high acidity or bold and full-bodied with plenty of tannins, you're ready to talk wine like a pro. These 5 sensory characteristics are the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of wine. Once you know how to recognize and describe them, you'll start choosing wines that truly fit your taste, whether you're at home, dining out, or shopping for your next bottle. By knowing these 5 things, you'll never feel lost in wine conversations again. You'll feel empowered to pick wines you love and even impress your friends with your newfound knowledge. Trust me, these 5 characteristics and being able to talk about them will totally revolutionize the way that you experience wine. And the even better news is, this is just scratching the surface of what's waiting for you in the world of wine. So let's recap. Our 5 sensory characteristics are sweetness, acidity, tannins, alcohol, and body. So remember, wine isn't about knowing every detail. It's about understanding what you love. So when you pay attention to these 5 characteristics, you'll start enjoying wine in a whole new way. So go ahead, pour a glass, and start exploring your palate with confidence. What will likely happen is as you start refining what it is that you like, it's going to open you up to whole new flavor profiles. So you may find out that what you love today may be completely different a year from now. That's very typical. When I talk to people in the wine industry, they're always talking about what phase they're in. So maybe they went through a tannic wine phase, and then they went through a sparkling wine phase, and then they went through a Pinot Noir phase, because Pinot Noir can be all realms, all ranges of the spectrum. Same with Chardonnay. So you may find that once you hone in on the things that you like today, it may actually broaden your horizons for new wines that you want to try tomorrow. Thanks for joining me today. Wine tasting is all about discovering what works for you. Keeping these 5 sensory characteristics in mind, you are well on your way to becoming the wine expert at your next dinner party or happy hour. Until next time, keep exploring, keep sipping, and most of all, enjoy the journey. Cheers.